Have you ever looked through your pictures and thought these images just aren't as sharp as I thought they should be? Well, getting sharp images in wildlife photography can be tricky, but incredibly rewarding. Today, I'll go through the things that I think of when in the field to make sure I get sharp images. Now, before we talk about equipment, we need to talk about the quality of light. Sharpness isn't just about clarity, it's also about contrast. Contrast defines small edges and fine details, making your images appear sharper. When you have a strong directional light, it highlights and deepens shadows along the edges, making them pop. This effect can be a real asset when photographing wildlife, as seen in these shots of a leopard where the fur seems to leap off the screen in this really good light. Now, on the other hand, diffused or low light can often soften edges and reduce contrast, making details appear muddy or flat. Now, as a wildlife photographer, the light itself is the one thing that we don't really have control of. It is our job as wildlife photographers to make the most of what is available with the natural elements. Now, when it comes to actual camera settings, there are three main things that play the biggest role in getting sharp images. Now, when shooting wildlife, we're often using long lenses, and most of these long lenses come with an image stabilizer. Not only is it important to have the image stabilizer turned on, but to also make sure that it is on the right mode for what you're shooting. Most standard telephoto lenses these days have at least two modes of image stabilization. One for general shots where the subject is kind of static, and the second is for when the subject is moving side to side. Make sure to read your manuals to ensure your lens is in the correct image stabilization mode. When it comes to actual camera settings themselves, when heading out to the field, the first thing you should do is look at the available light and set your ISO accordingly. When shooting in low light conditions, we often crank up the ISO to get a workable exposure. But high ISO introduces noise, which then reduces sharpness. The issue isn't the ISO itself, but rather the lack of light, which forces the camera to boost the signal to the sensor, which amplifies noise. Photos taken at a lower ISO typically have more detail and clarity and less noise to clutter the image. Now, sadly, as many of you wildlife photographers out there will know, we don't really get to choose when our animal is doing something really nice. Often on game drives in Africa, the cats are out early and late in the afternoon, meaning we have to shoot in low light. Now, the second main camera setting that has the biggest effect on sharpness, and the one that I see as a photographic guide the most, is shutter speed. A key factor in sharpness is matching your shutter speed to the subject's motion. Now, this may take many years to master, but once you do this, you'll see a great improvement in sharpness. For static scenes, a lower shutter speed works fine, but for wildlife, even a slight movement can blur an image if your shutter speed isn't fast enough. For fast-moving subjects like birds in flight, I set my shutter speed to at least 1/3200th of a second. And for moderately fast subjects, around 1/1000 to 1/2000th of a second. If you're unsure and you can get away with it, just increase your shutter speed by a couple of stops and I'm sure you'll see a massive improvement to the number of images which are now sharp. Now, this brings me to my first trade-off. Wildlife photography is always about trade-offs. There is never a perfect scenario. A lot of people out there will tell you that gear doesn't make a difference. And sadly, those people are not right. Now, you can get some amazing lenses these days for a very low budget, but they come with a maximum aperture of 6.3, 7.1, or even f11. Now, these are awesome lenses for saving in the wallet. However, being at such a small maximum aperture, you are letting in a tiny amount of light through the lens, therefore hitting the sensor. This means on average your ISO will be higher and your shutter speed will be lower. Now let's take a practical example. If I'm shooting with my 400mm f2.8 at ISO 3200 and I'm getting a shutter speed of 1,000th of a second, a person in the same sighting as me with a 6.3 maximum aperture lens will only be getting a 200th of a second with the same ISO settings. A person with a maximum aperture of 7.1 will be down at 160th of a second. And those amazingly cheap f11 lenses, well, those guys will be shooting at a 60th of a second. Now, those photographers can get around this by aiming for a lower shutter speed and raising their ISO. And typically they will have to do a combination of both. As we know, both of these things equal less sharpness. So therefore, having more expensive lenses with larger maximum apertures really does help with sharpness in the long run. Now, not everybody out there can afford a $6,000 to $12,000 lens, especially if wildlife photography is just a hobby. Luckily, sharpness can be brought back a little bit in post-production afterwards. Another thing I see on safari quite often is people not necessarily having a good understanding on how their autofocus system works in their camera. Now, all cameras these days, be it DSLR or mirrorless, all have multiple different types of autofocus functions. The most important is your one-shot or single servo versus AI servo or continuous focus. For wildlife on the move, we need to be in continuous servo or AI servo so that the camera tracks the animal and keeps the focus on the animal while it moves. If we are shooting in single servo or one shot, when you half press the shutter, the focus locks, and if the animal is moving, it is now walked out of the sharpest area of the picture. With a lens like my 400mm 2.8, if an animal is only a couple of meters away from me, my depth of field can be millimeters. This means if I misfocus or I'm not perfectly focused on that animal's eye, the image will appear to be soft. The life of the image always lies in the animal's eyes, so getting these sharp is very important. Now, when it comes to actually shooting, stability is very important, especially with longer lenses and slower shutter speeds. Now, a tripod and a monopod are great, but not always practical when it comes to safaris. If you're forced to handhold, there's a couple of things you can do to increase your odds of staying still. Now, shooting with something a bit smaller like the 70 to 200, it's very easy to keep still when you're out in the field. However, shooting with something much bigger like this 400mm, you have a lot more chance of wobbling under the weight. A nice technique is to make sure that your left hand is in the most balanced part of the camera and lens. Keeping your left elbow tucked right up against your body as well helps you hold the whole system still. This allows your right arm to do all the movements while focusing and aiming, but your left arm is doing all the heavy lifting. Lastly, I want to leave you a little tip about perceived sharpness. Is this image sharp? What about this one? Now, I would argue for artistic purposes, yes, they are. Now, a technique I absolutely love when it's low light and very difficult to get crisp, sharp shots is to shoot these slow shutter panning images. Not only are these great for blurring busy backgrounds and isolating the subject, but they're also really nice for increasing the look of your portfolio. These are done by using a very slow shutter speed and moving your lens at the same speed the animal is moving. I often shoot between 200th of a second for incredibly fast moving subjects like birds, all the way down to 2 seconds for slow moving animals like cats. Somewhere between a 10th of a second and a 20th of a second is the general sweet spot. Now, it wouldn't be photography without editing, and there are a couple of ways to fake sharpness in editing later on. Now, like I say, we can't always choose where our subject will be what the background will be or what the light will be. However, in editing, we can assist with sharpness in a couple of different ways. Now, apparent sharpness is the perception of sharpness through contrast and texture rather than pure optical clarity. Enhancing contrast or focusing on areas with intricate textures like fur or feathers can make an image feel sharper to the viewer. This is a technique I often use in editing, especially when shooting in less than ideal light. A slight increase of local contrast can boost the details, adding three-dimensional qualities to your image. Now, this can be done in one of two ways. If your fur of your animal is already sharp, but your background is messy and also appears sharp, you can often flatten the background a little bit, taking away contrast. Alternatively, if it's just the animal's fur that needs a little bit of a pop, highlighting the animal with Lightroom's select subject and adding a little bit of clarity or texture can really make the difference. Now, in conclusion, I hope you can see that sharpness is not just about settings, but it's also about contrast, light, motion, stability, and technique. By thinking of these key elements while in the field next time, you will be well on your way to capturing sharper and more striking images. See you on the next one, and happy shooting.